Chapter 13. Kelin waited in the damp darkness for Dare to rescue him. She had always sprung him from trouble before. Admittedly, it was usually her fault they were in said situations, but she had always been there for him, and he'd always followed her. He refused to see any difference now. She'd come. After all, she'd saved his life before. The smithy had caught fire. It was an ever-present danger in a structure with wooden walls and a thatched roof. He'd been trapped between a burning wall and the forge, which was roaring like a beast of legend. He could still hear it now. Molten metal was splattering everywhere, spraying silvery drops that started more fires where they impacted. He'd spun around again and again, but he could not find a way through the burning timber. Sweating tears, he remembered coughing and folding forward on the ground. His skin had felt so hot. Dare had defied the flames. There had been no path through the fire, but she made one by bashing apart the flaming wreckage with a small log. Then she had stood over him, reached down, and yanked him to his feet. The air had stung because it had felt so cold when she pulled him outside. In that icy air, there had been the concerned faces of Avice, Donley, Sigurd, and his parents. He'd been all right. They'd rebuilt. He'd been all right. But maybe this was too much for her, he thought, and the tendrils of doubt curled tighter. He struggled for a damp breath as he tried to make out the walls that seemed to be closing in on him. He fought against oncoming tears. It wasn't only because of the pain or the humiliation, but because he missed home. He yearned to smell the scents from the forge again, to hear his brothers' and sisters' laughter, to see Avice's face. He wanted to go back there, shut the door, and never come out. In a few years, he'd be the town blacksmith. Sigurd would join the other old men sipping beer and telling each other heartfelt lies. He'd build a new home behind the forge that didn't flood every other year like his father's mill. That way, he wouldn't raise his own children with their ankles often wet. He released the tension in his muscles. He would never see that. He knew it as much as he knew his blood was red. After all, they'd shown him quite a bit of it. He was going to die here. A comforting notion, he mused, as he let himself slip a little closer into darkness. It would be such a relief. No. Dare was going to come, so he'd better be here. He wanted to be furious with her. In fact, he begged himself to give in to that rage. And he refused. If he were angry with her, she might not rescue him. He wound himself into a tighter ball on the stone floor. His eyes rolled back in his head. Here we go, he thought. It's happening again. He knew it was useless as they dragged him from his cell and into another chamber. He was a large man, and yet these two stick-thin guards had carried him without apparent effort. The third man, already waiting inside, turned around and smiled. You were almost able to make history. Kelin licked his lips. What? It was nearly impossible to understand the speaker through his accent. You almost got to be the one to tell the world that we Kelin still exist. What? He stared ahead. The Storm Readers? They were from the stories about the Chentum Wars, but that's all they were. Stories. He dropped his gaze. He was too exhausted to try denying it. The Kemen's smile broadened. Of course, everyone will know soon. Let's begin, shall we? Tell me about the prince. Prince? He moved so quickly that Kelin barely had time to tense. The Kemen plunged a thin knife right through his chest and retracted it in one smooth motion. Kelin gasped. He gasped again, but suddenly he couldn't get enough air. Mortals need both lungs, don't they? Well, from now on, you'll have to live with one. Pain took over from there. While he was still reeling, they forced his mouth open and ground in it with a large file. His flesh and teeth broke away in blossoms of agony, and his hindered lung exploded in anguish when he couldn't gasp any longer. In moments, his teeth were just pieces that wouldn't fit back together. It wasn't anything like a dream. He knew every second, intimately. The Kelin dropped heated gravel onto his chest. It felt cold, then hot, searing, and even liquid fire. Smoke wafted up from the burns, and he smelled his own flesh cooking. And he could not draw one full inhale. The pain was unending, and through it all, he couldn't breathe. That's what broke him. He doubted he could withstand the other torments, but every time he tried to inhale, it felt like hammers inside his chest. Weeping, he gave in and told them what little he knew, even details he didn't think he would have remembered. He spat and blubbered it through the tooth shards and bloody gums. He told them everything, and still, they tortured him. Dare knew she was dying. A person wasn't meant to survive that. She flicked at the grey lumps of flesh falling off her body as she fumbled for control of the swollen sticks that were her fingers. They hadn't bothered to chain her again, and had left a candle burning. She exhaled and lay back on the stone floor, drifting in and out of consciousness and pain. She'd never imagined that it would end like this. Part of her refused to believe it. Then the agony cut in and made this fate all too real. She was ashamed of herself and couldn't explain why. But that humiliating rage burned underneath her skin just as much as the acid. She would have to be greater than this, she told herself, and smarter, too. She had known it was a trap. That's why she went in Caleb's stead. Next time, she vowed, she wouldn't be caught. At least he had the wisdom to be silent about himself. She clawed at that logic, because it was practical and had probably saved his life, but she found herself resenting him. Dare pushed herself up to sitting and swayed, watching the colors dance across her vision. She wasn't going to die like this. She yanked herself to her feet and growled against the pain as she stumbled forward and collapsed against the door. She flailed against the wood to keep herself from sliding down to the floor. After scrabbling for an endless moment, she gained her balance. She heaved her shoulder against the wood and tried to find the door's handle. She watched the lump of her hand bang against the latch. At least there was one, she thought, so this space was probably not originally a cell. But the notion passed. She couldn't control her fingers and just bashed them against the cold metal, splitting fresh cuts open across her skin. It wouldn't turn. No matter how long she thrashed, she could not manage the latch. And she had no idea if it was even locked. Grunting, she leaned back against the door and wheezed. She pushed herself away and glared through the haze that permeated her vision. She wobbled as she tried to maintain her balance. In her experience, she hadn't encountered too many problems that couldn't be solved with a meaningful, well-placed kick. But she wasn't sure if she could even feel her feet. She braced herself to line the kick up nonetheless. It wasn't fair. She sagged and lowered her foot. It was hard to remember all her heroic dreams now. She had been robbed, because those were meant to have happened, not this. She stumbled forward. Anything but this. She swallowed and felt a weight sink all the way through her stomach. Tears stung her eyes as she tried to picture how it should have been, but the agony of the acid anchored her inside the cell. She hadn't deserved this, and neither had Kelin. He ought to be safe in River's Bridge. She sensed heat flowing to her face and began growling beneath her whimpers. She wanted to lash out against Caleb, the Kemen, and fate itself. Wheezing, she raised her foot when the door swung open on its own to reveal a Kemen. She kicked at him just as he gasped. He reeled back toward a second storm reader who was carrying another tray. Dare hissed as she saw the clear liquid sloshing in its jar. She jumped and swept the jar off the tray with the flat of her hand. It smashed against the head of the first Kemen. The glass shattered and the acid splashed over his face. He screamed. It began as a roar, but as soon as the acid flowed into his mouth, the scream became a squeal and then a low, horrified moan. She kept kicking as he went down, clawing at his cheeks. The second Kemen shoved her. She swung her foot at him and missed. Then she rebounded off the wall and tried to press against it for balance, but her hands were sluggish to respond. The first Kemen twisted upright and ran off down the hall, stumbling with every step. The second storm reader kicked her legs out from under her. He rolled her on her back and pounded his fist against her ear. She yelped and batted at him with her arms, but she couldn't shake him off. The Kemen leaned over her face. "You?" She heaved upward and bit his throat. She lanced through his windpipe. She chewed and tugged until she felt her teeth grinding against each other. The Kemen tried to gasp, but had nothing left with which to inhale. He stuck his fingers deep into his opened throat to stem the flow of blood. He spasmed and rolled off her, and within a few frantic seconds he was dead on the floor. Dare stared at the ceiling and heard herself gasping and hacking. She attempted to stand, but collapsed again. The heat of rage melted and she was left drained. Still coughing, she curled up. What now? How could she even find Kelin? She lugged herself up onto her elbows. Then she pulled herself to her feet by crawling up the wall. After that, she lurched toward the door leading out of her cell and would have screamed if she had enough energy left. A third Kemen rested against the doorframe. She hadn't heard him approach. Unlike the other two, he carried a sword at his side in a plain sheath. His orange eyes were wider than she'd expected, and she realized that he was staring at her. And not just staring, but watching her with the disbelieving surprise of seeing a fish walking on land. She crouched for a lunge, but the Kemen raised a hand. Dare leaned her weight against the wall. She coughed out blood, and she wasn't sure whose it was. She tried to recreate that red rage, but she felt her anger sliding out of her grasp, leaving her hollow and dizzy. The Kemen cocked his head. "What was your next move?" His common was remarkably unaccented compared to her torturers. He pointed at the corpse. "Rescue my friend," she growled. He snorted and folded his arms in a single, swift motion. She slipped against the wall and sank almost a foot. She fought to form the words, "Well, if you're not going to kill me, I'll be on my way." Her tongue felt like a dead weight, and she heard how slurred she was. The storm reader arched an eyebrow. She shoved herself at him with all the momentum she could summon. He moved to the side of the doorway, and she stumbled past him. "I do not think you understand what hell has swallowed you." She staggered to a halt. She wasn't entirely sure about when things had happened, but she'd been very certain about the events and what had been said. "That was you?" He nodded. Then he grabbed her ear and pulled. Outside in the corridor, the air didn't stink as much, mostly smoke from the torches lining it. Then again, Everything smelled acrid after her torture. She hammered her hands against his arm to no avail. She dragged her feet in vain. She coughed, and her tongue limped against the side of her mouth as she managed, "Who are you?" He didn't answer. She batted at his hold on her ear again and forced out, "I'm dying 'cause of you." He stopped. "Not because of me." His orange eyes turned on her with an intelligence she recognized as outmatching her own. She ground her teeth. "You knew, and you didn't do anything." The Kelin shrugged. "Your life is not as important as the information you may have had." She opened her mouth, but he moved faster than her words and slipped 2 fingers into her throat. She gagged and tumbled back, but he tugged her upright. "Now, if you speak another word, I will leave you to die." She glared and inhaled sharply, and then Kelin's face fizzled in her mind. She glared harder, but nodded. "Be mindful of how little time you have." He led her down the hall while she tripped and stumbled to keep up. She stared hard at his back, wondering if this play was some method of getting even more information from her. Then again, she hadn't withheld anything. Shortly, he spun her around by her ear and she found herself facing an unremarkable wooden door. The Kelin opened it. He pushed her through. Dare lurched to remain upright, but tripped over something heavy and heaving. She crumpled over it and split her chin on the stone floor. Then she realized that the lump she'd fallen over was wheezing. And not very well, it dawned on her. Kelin's breaths were shallow and whimpering. What did they do to him? In the meager light from the hole, she couldn't see much external damage. As best as she could without the full use of her fingers, she pushed the dark, curly hair from her friend's face. He shuddered and squeezed in a tighter ball. She leaned against him. No, it's me, it's Dare." Her voice sounded as if it were being strangled before she spoke. Forming every word hurt, but that chord of pain went unnoticed in the symphony of agony. He mumbled something and tried to avert his gaze. She looked up at the Kelin in the door, who had his eyes trained down the hallway. "Kelin, get up." He didn't respond. "Kelin." She pushed herself back. "Kelin, listen to me." When he failed to answer this time, she slapped him. "Kelin Miller, get on your feet! If I can be walking, so can you. Now get up!" His eyelids fluttered. His speech was so mangled that she didn't recognize the sound. She guessed it was her name. "Yeah, it's me." "Come." The storm reader beckoned but continued to watch the corridor. Dare tried to lift Kelin up, but could not even get her fingers to grasp anything. "Please, we have to go." "Now," said the Kelin. "A moment." "No." Kelin muttered something incoherent. His breath was just a shallow wheeze. Dare looked up. "I can't carry him." The Kelin shrugged. "Leave him." "No." "Then I'm leaving you." He turned away. "Why did you even help me in the first place?" Her head was spinning so much she thought she would fall over if she weren't already on the floor. She paused for a large breath and forced herself to concentrate. "You're a traitor." His expression remained calm. "There are no Kelin traitors. So they say. To you, I'm the hero." "You're not a hero," she snarled, surprised at the venom in her own voice. She'd convinced herself of heroes, and they were nothing like this stranger. "Only if we flee. Otherwise, I may have to kill you and say I stumbled across your escape." The Kelin stepped inside and hauled Kelin off the floor. The motion was too simple, as Kelin was much heavier than the storm reader. Dare began to wonder what other differences the Kelin had from humanity than eye color. He shoved Kelin into her arms. The Kelin stalked down the corridor ahead of them. But Kelin weighed Dare down, and she only made it a few steps before they both fell. Kelin wheezed. "I'll make it." He gasped for air. She tugged on his shoulder. "Better to die trying." She managed to lift him up with his help. She pressed her back against the wall. He sagged and was slipping down against her weak grasp. She looked at him, noticing he still had some color left on his face. "I'll get you out." He shook his head. Dare, staring at him, could not read if he understood or not. Then he dropped most of his weight on her, and she, trembling all over, lost her fragile grip. He fell again. She crawled over to him, watching the sweat drip off her nose. "Up! Get up!" She tried to lift his shoulder. "Help!" She trailed off when she looked up and saw she was speaking to nothing but air. They were alone. Then again, this had been farther than she'd secretly expected to get. She glanced around but had no idea which way to go. She felt the pain closing in as she pulled herself back up. Distantly, but not as far away as she first thought, she heard a cacophony of shrill whinnies. Horses? Here? The Kelin rounded the corner into the hall, his heels clicking against the floor. Dare glared at him. "Help him up." But the storm reader just stared. "I can't carry him, please." The Kelin's orange eyes were the widest she'd ever seen. Bile stung her throat. The storm reader went for a knife on his belt, and she saw he didn't carry a sword at all. She tried to pull Kelin back down the hall away from the Kelin, but his weight was already making her knees tremble. She told herself that their new ally would get them out. She watched the Kelin's knife reflect in the torchlight as he pulled it free. She held her breath and waited for him to collapse with a sword in his back. She'd never believed in stabbing in the back, but with Kelin's and her lives in immediate jeopardy, she could find nothing wrong with it. Any second now. But the Kelin didn't fall. She eased herself in front of Kelin and crouched. The storm reader took a swipe at her head, but she fell to the floor where she grabbed the Kelin's calves and lunged with her shoulders. The storm reader went down and crushed Dare underneath his weight. The Kelin hopped back to his feet like a cat. She went for his knees this time. He stepped out of her reach and caught her with a small cut on the back of her head. However, he had retreated near to Kelin, who kicked out with a gasp of pain. The Kelin turned to slash at Kelin, and Dare jumped. With just her palms, she tried to wrestle for control of the knife. She saw the blade cut into her hands several times, but she couldn't get her fingers to work enough to capture a grip. So she kicked. The Kelin stumbled back, and she shoved him even farther in the same direction. He bounced off the far wall. She tensed, waiting for him to spin around. Instead, he slumped forward, his own knife protruding from his chest. She didn't immediately fathom what had happened. She let herself slip to the floor, breathing out as she sank. "You aren't useless." An imperious voice drifted down. Dare hissed as she raised her head enough to see the Kelin with the sword. Her lips framed a question. "Any deaths must be on your hands. They will investigate." He leaned down and hauled Kelin to his feet. Without another word, he dragged the blacksmith down the corridor, leaving Dare to limp and stumble on her own. Soon, they left the torch-lit corridors and tiptoed into murky, darker paths. There was only enough light to reveal more darkness ahead. She tried to let her fingers glide along the rough stone walls, but she couldn't feel through her swollen digits. The walls looked more like those of a cave than a dungeon. Kelin muttered something, but she didn't make out the sounds. She dipped her head close to his chest, listening to him struggle for even the shallowest of breaths. The Kelin stopped. He gestured ahead with his hand, and then turned. She furrowed her brow in suspicion, but managed, "Thank you." He nodded. The darkness closed its cloak around him as he walked away. Dare leaned against the wall, too tired to move. Kelin rolled on his back. She sighed, "Can't stay here." But she felt her bones sagging and the physical weight of pain pinning her to the floor. Kelin grunted. "Up!" "What?" "Look!" He coughed. "Up!" Above, a thick puncture in the rock let in moonlight, but it was over their heads. "Help me!" She pushed herself up on the wall. He shook his head. She scrabbled for purchase on the rock. With a small jump, she wedged her hands against the stone. She had practiced pull-ups in the barn all the time, but then she had the full use of her hands. She never had to lift her weight using mostly her wrists before. She struggled and kicked before she was rewarded. The sweet-tasting breeze brushed her cheeks. The moonlight was blinding. She kept pulling and wriggling until she was free of the crack. Damp grass rubbed her ankles and legs, and it was softer than any blanket. She twisted and thrust down her arm. "Kelin, please!" The moon caught the remnants of the dwarven bandage. She had completely forgotten about that injury. He thumped his head against the wall and fought to form the words, "Don't fit. Then you're going to lose weight really fast." Reluctantly, he rolled forward, pulled himself up, and grabbed her hand. She heaved and gritted her teeth. She didn't let go, and by now the pain in her muscles was so great they were almost numb. Dare watched his chest shudder with every hacking breath. His feet were off the floor, dangling. He couldn't fit. Panicking, he started kicking. "Exhale, Kelin, exhale!" she hissed, straining against her agony and his weight. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Since she couldn't hold on to Kelin's arms well, she made certain he grabbed her around her neck. Then she pushed and pulled so hard she thought she heard one of her knees crack. She wrenched him free. They collapsed onto the cold ground. Dare twisted to see the hell they'd escaped. Across a stone-filled creek, it was just an unremarkable abandoned castle, half rotted away. "Made it." Then there was darkness in her vision. It wasn't a tunnel. It was a wall, and she hit it.